All right, these are going to be our notes for Friday, January 31st. We left off yesterday with looking at some of the liberal impacts of France. We got through it very briefly, though. Talking very briefly about Louis XVIII, how he does try to enforce and keep this constitutional charter he creates in the 18 teens to help keep and carry out liberal reforms in France. But we were going through limitations on Thursday, saying that only the top 100,000 males out of 30 million of their population in France had the right to vote. So while the charter is helpful why it increases liberal input, it only does so to kind of the upper middle classes. They outnumber the aristocracy, but it still does not involve all the middle class types like we talked about yesterday: businessmen, war profiteers, professionals, ex-revolutionaries, landowners, Bourbons, Bonapartes, all those different people. So that's kind of where we left off. So picking up with a new spot, we're going to be looking at Charles X, so the replacement for Louis XVIII. So Louis gets a conservative successor, Charles X, who wanted to try to reestablish the old order. This is not his son. I think it's I don't think it was even a brother. It's somebody who's closely related to him, maybe a cousin or something. But Charles X takes over, and he's going to want to try to reestablish the old order in France. He was increasingly blocked by the opposition of the deputies, meaning like his government advisors, and also the members of the parliament in France. So he was increasingly blocked by the opposition of the deputies. Charles's government turned in 1830 to military advancement, or turned to like military attacks and advancements to hopefully rally French nationalism and gain support. So basically, he wasn't getting anywhere with the parliament in France. So he thought, well, maybe if I just take this, kind of make a military, outing, it'll kind of rally right behind me, kind of like Napoleon did. So in June of 1830, 37,000 French soldiers invaded Algiers. So they decided to invade North Africa. 37,000 French soldiers invaded Algiers and started a war that lasted until 1847. He does not remain king that long, but the war itself will last that long. Basically, they felt like, well, we can go and kind of expand ourselves and kind of become imperial to some degree and try to gain new territories and everything else. So they go there. It seems like they're going to win at first, and the Algerians kind of rally, and the war ends up basically lasting 17 years. But this is kind of mark the rebirth of French imperialism that we'll talk about more later on in the next unit, or actually the next 2 units from now. All right, revolt against Charles X, or Chucky X as I call him. Emboldened by good news from Algiers in 1830, Charles repudiated the constitutional charter. So like they go in, they surprise attack Algiers. The French are successful at first, so he's like, okay, we're successful, things are going well. I'm going to go ahead and use this opportunity because everybody's happy about our win to go ahead and repudiate the charter that Louis XVIII had established. So he repudiated the constitutional charter in an attempted coup in July of 1830. So he repudiated the constitutional charter in July of 1830. He then censored the press and issued decrees stripping wealthy middle class of their voting rights. So he censored the press and issued decrees stripping wealthy middle class of voting rights, and the aristocracy, the middle classes. So he censored the press and issued decrees stripping wealthy middle class of voting rights. The immediate reaction was an insurrection at the capital by liberal lawyers. So a lot of the middle class people, liberal lawyers, journalists, and middle class businessmen revolted and protested. So the immediate reaction was an insurrection in the capital by liberal lawyers and journalists and middle class businessmen. Printers, artisans, and traders were fired up over popular republicanism, and they rioted too. So basically, because he created the situation, now you're going to get a big surge and trying to push for republicanism that takes place in France because of his actions with trying to suspend the charter. So printers, artisans, and traders were also fired up and are now pushing for republicanism as well too. 3 days of fighting led to the government being overthrown. So 3 days of fighting and protest leads to the French government being overthrown again, and Chucky X will flee. So Chucky X goes into exile, never to return, and never be king again. And he was no one's favorite. So the upper middle class decided to kind of go after their guy, kind of like a guy who was related to the king, who they thought would be a better replacement. So the upper middle class abandoned the more radical protesters and decided to appoint another monarch. So the radical protesters would have probably preferred to just go straight republicanism or something more like where it's all representational and no monarch. But the upper middle class and the aristocracy still appreciated a monarch, and so they kind of abandoned the lower middle classes, and they go ahead and they go for another monarch named Louis Philippe. So this guy right here is Charles X. I don't know what you can see his picture. This is Charles X. This is Louis Philippe. So Louis Philippe is the guy they select, who was also related to the king, to become the new king. That way they could create stability and basically maintain constitutional monarchy and not go to complete republicanism. All right, the effects of this. So there's a famous saying that when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So basically, just kind of like before, when they had this revolution, it inspires other revolutions too. So there's other effects here. So France kind of settles down after all this happens, and Louis Philippe comes in and tries to restore order as a more pro-liberal monarch. But other areas of Europe are inspired to basically protest. So other countries are impacted. In the Netherlands, Belgium Catholics revolted against the Dutch king and established the independent Kingdom of Belgium. If you recall, after the Napoleonic Wars, they tried to create this Kingdom of the Netherlands in that area, and so basically it only lasts about 15 years, now it breaks apart. So in 1830, the Belgian Catholics revolted against the Dutch king, who they were mostly Protestant, and they established their own independent Kingdom of Belgium. So that whole experiment failed and went away after about 15 years. So they break apart. In Switzerland, liberal assemblies in various regions forced their national government to amend their constitution. So in Switzerland, liberal assemblies in various regions forced their national government to amend their constitution. It led to 2 decades of political conflict there in Switzerland. So they're also trying to make liberal reforms in Switzerland too. In Polish territory, not Poland, because remember Poland's not a territory, not a country right now. It's controlled by either the Prussians or by Austrians or by the Russians. In Polish territory, a nationalist rebellion was put down by the Russian Imperial Army trying to create independence. So in the 1830s, Polish people were inspired to basically break off, become independent, and that fails as well too. So in this short time period, you're going to get basically Belgian independence. You get Belgian independence in 1830, and this is where their flag is the black, the gold, and the red. But kind of like the tricolors, that's going to become their national flag, represents their new nation. Belgium becomes independent in 1830, same year as Greece. Switzerland goes through some changes and protests, and then Poland goes through some protests as well, but their protests won't really go anywhere. So let's talk about France briefly between 1830 and 1848. So we're not really going to go into this today. It's not something you have to know for like the unit test or anything, but we're going to watch Les Miserables on Monday, or part of it at least, and we're going to talk about the minor French revolt in 1832. So the revolt that you see take place in Les Miserables is based on a real revolt, but it's very brief. Just like the movie, it lasts only a couple days. So it's not one you have to talk about here. But there is another very brief revolution in Paris in 32, but it fails pretty quickly. The political situation in France remains mostly the same with Louis Philippe. So Louis Philippe, who is this kind of people-chosen king, will reign fairly okay for the next 18 years, essentially. He reestablishes the constitutional charter that Louis XVIII had. So he goes back and reestablishes constitutional charter. He also adopts the tricolor flag of the French Revolution. So the tricolor flag was only around during the French Revolution. Then they go with Napoleon having a flag, and then they go back to like a Bourbon monarchy flag. And now permanently from 1830 onward, basically France adopts the tricolors, which will become their national flag forever. But besides these two changes, nothing really else happens. Louis Philippe, they believe he'd be a good person to protect liberal reforms, which he does at first, but over time kind of becomes more conservative. But he himself does not really try to do anything else that's dramatically liberal at this point. Beyond these symbolic gestures of the tricolor flag and the constitutional charter, popular demands for thorough reform went unanswered. So he never does any kind of substantial reform after he becomes king. The narrow liberal institutions were just maintained. So the things that were kind of going on before are just maintained under him, and nothing really ever improves or changes. Republicans, Democrats, and social reformers and the poor of Paris were very disappointed in the effects of the 1830 revolution. Nothing really changed. So Republicans, Democrats, social reformers, and the poor of Paris were all bitterly disappointed. Nothing really changed with him. So we'll stop the first video there.